The challenge arrived as a broadcast that spread across the stars and carried a weight that even the youngest child in the refugee ships could feel. The coalition of rightful claims had gathered 1 million alien soldiers and machines and had set them in a ring around the human corridor. Their message was simple and merciless. Humanity had trespassed, had broken rules, had dared to survive where survival was not allowed. The punishment was to close the corridor, burn the ships inside, and erase the memory of those who tried to flee. Yet the coalition wanted more than destruction. They wanted a show that would echo across the galaxy. They announced a duel under ancient law, 1 human against 1 million alien soldiers. If the human endured for a single day, the refugees would live. If the human fell, the corridor would die in silence and ash. Inside one of the smaller command sloops, Captain Aisha Khan listened to the message. She was no stranger to cruel games dressed as honor. The refugee sloop was no warship. It carried no heavy cannons or reinforced armor. Only people who had already lost everything once before and could not afford to lose again. In the cargo holds, families huddled together in fear while the older ones whispered prayers. Aisha sat in her workroom, a small place with a cracked viewport, and studied the words of the coalition. She demanded to see the ancient dual law for herself. The sloop printed it for her in thin sheets, each line etched in letters that seemed to breathe. She read carefully. The champion must be mortal, no peers allowed on the field. The ground must be neutral, chosen between both sides. The victory would be decided by endurance and survival, not by slaying the enemy. There were gaps in the words, spaces that left meaning undefined. Aid from environment was not forbidden. Sight of the crowd was not explained. Aisha knew at once that in those cracks a human could breathe and bend the law to shape. The crew waited for someone to speak, but no one dared. They knew that to volunteer was to walk into death. Aisha stood and said only, "I will go." She did not say it with pride or with the loud voice of a hero, but with the calm certainty of a woman who understood that the corridor would burn if no one stepped forward. The reply from the coalition came swiftly, almost too swiftly, as if they had been waiting for her. They sent coordinates of a broken moon suspended between 2 pale suns. The moon was stripped of mines and shields, a bare surface where a duel could be watched by every ship in the sector. She went to the storage chamber and opened the case that held her old suit. It was a human design, not elegant but dependable. It flexed in high gravity, locked joints when bones threatened to give way, filtered poison and ice when either would have killed her. She traced the seams she had stitched herself and remembered storms on her training world where the ocean climbed into the sky and predators hunted in packs that never slept. That world had taught her to read the invisible currents of chaos as if they were a language. Panic had been an enemy she had folded and put away in a box she never opened again. The evacuees watched her prepare. They had no words, only gestures. Each one touched the suit as if to polish it or lend a fragment of strength. A child stepped forward holding a scarf that once belonged to her mother and tied it around Aisha's arm over the hard fabric. It was no armor by military standards, but it became the strongest shield she could wear. Aisha promised to return it and stepped into the small shuttle that would take her to the moon. When she approached, the sight made her breath slow. Ships filled the void in every direction, each shaped like teeth or wings or jagged forests of steel. The coalition opened a lane for her, narrow and sharp as if she were an insect being guided into a glass jar. She landed the shuttle on black stone, a crust of basalt cracked by old fire. The ground sang with hidden pressure beneath her boots. Tall pylons ringed the plain, each humming with a faint vibration that made her teeth ache. The coalition loved their theater, and this field was built as a stage for a spectacle. A tall envoy approached, armored in plates that shimmered like wet metal. Its mask was faceted, and in every small facet Aisha saw her own reflection. The envoy repeated the rules with mechanical patience and asked her last request. Aisha demanded only 2 things: that a visible timer be shown to all so none could deny the measure of a day, and that any who fell outside the boundaries be granted medical care rather than discarded. The envoy tilted its head, unsettled by the strange mercy, but could not refuse without breaking their own law. A bright line appeared across the sky, marking the day she must endure. She began to breathe in the steady cadence drilled into her bones during her earliest trials. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. She let the rhythm travel through her chest until her pulse matched it. Then she set her suit to broadcast that quiet beat on a hidden band, a whisper under the coalition channels. She knew rhythms could move minds, and she intended to make use of that law of nature. When the signal came, it was not a roar of trumpets, but a soft chime like a door opening. At the far edge of the field, shadows began to rise into figures. Ranks unfolded like endless rows of grass bending to the wind. The weight of 1,000,000 eyes fell upon her. Aisha adjusted the scarf on her arm, placed her boots firmly on the cracked stone, and began to walk toward them with the calm of a woman who had already chosen the price she was willing to pay. Though, first night on the broken moon was a theater of tension where even silence seemed sharpened to a blade. Aisha Khan stood alone on the scarred basalt plain with the scarf tied on her arm and the hum of the pylons in her bones. Across the ring of banners, the coalition shifted restlessly, as if unsure whether they were audience or executioners. They had gathered to see a single human crushed under the weight of numbers, but the law said she only had to endure, and that word endured had been humanity's story for as long as it had wandered among the stars. Aisha knew that brute strength could not serve her against 1,000,000 enemies, and that every second of survival had to be bought with wit and memory. She began her quiet preparation by studying the land with the eyes of someone who had grown up on a world that tried to kill her every day. That world had been a death world by galactic measure, a place so hostile that even seasoned alien explorers marked it red on their charts and swore never to step foot there again. For Aisha, it had been home and school and forge. She had learned to drink air heavy with storms, to walk on rocks that shifted underfoot like living beasts, and to find rhythm in chaos that never ended. She remembered the times when sandglass winds roared across valleys, cutting flesh from bone, and the only way to survive had been to predict their arrival by reading the trembling of distant trees or the shift of shadows on cliff faces. She remembered predators with eyes like molten stone who hunted in coordinated silence, and how she had survived by listening to the faintest pause in the chorus of the jungle. These lessons were burned into her body, not just her mind, and now they rose like faithful companions as she paced the broken moon and mapped its hidden language. The basalt plain was not dead stone but a skeleton of old fire. Beneath the surface she felt the pressure of gases that had not yet found release. Small cracks marked lines of weakness, and shallow bowls would gather heat when the suns climbed higher in the sky. Thin dust clung to her boots, and she knew that with the right sound it could rise in sheets and blind even the keenest eyes. To the coalition, it was a simple field chosen for symmetry and spectacle. To Aisha, it was a living weapon waiting for hands patient enough to shape it. She drew maps in her head, lines of pressure and pools of energy, paths that she could force her enemies into. She bent and set tiny markers, not of metal or machine, but shards of stone stacked in patterns that her own eye alone would recognize. The alien sensors would ignore them as meaningless, but to her they were anchors in the flow of the coming storm. The coalition began their opening move by sending drones. Swarms of small machines meant to test and exhaust. They did not waste living soldiers at first, for they believed a single human was hardly worth the trouble of real warriors. Aisha did not meet them head-on. Instead, she lured them toward the heat bowls where the twin suns bent their light into shimmering curtains. She moved slowly, conserving energy, and let the drones chase. The heat warped their sensors, splitting her image into dozens of mirages until the machines began firing at phantoms. She walked calmly through the shifting light, and the galaxy watching from afar began to murmur. For the first time, the 1,000,000 faced the possibility that the duel might not be over in minutes. As she moved, she breathed in the cadence she had set before. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. That rhythm steadied her blood, but also traveled on a hidden frequency beneath the coalition channels. She did not know how many alien minds were sensitive to cadence, but she knew that many species lived by collective beats, heart-like pulses that guided hunting packs or work crews. The human rhythm, simple and steady, began to creep into the subconscious of those who listened. It would not defeat them outright, but it would plant unease, a dissonance that might grow into hesitation when orders came. She understood that battles were not always won by blades, but by cracks in confidence. When the first drones fell against each other in confusion, slamming into rock where her phantom image had led them, Aisha turned her head slightly toward the banners where the commanders watched. She did not smile, but the set of her shoulders spoke of quiet defiance. She wanted them to know she saw through their numbers, that she could stretch seconds into minutes and minutes into hours. For every hour she stole, the refugees waiting in the corridor lived. She walked to the ridge line where cooled lava had frozen into black waves and crouched low. She pressed her gloved hand against the rock and felt a tremor. Beneath lay one of the pockets of trapped gas she had marked earlier. If she could coax the drones close enough, if she could time the resonance with her suit's amplifiers, the ground itself might become her ally. She rose slowly and began to chant in her own language. Not words, but sound. A low vibration that traveled through her chest and into the stone. The drones swarmed, drawn by her movement, and she held the tone steady until the basalt groaned. Then, with a sudden shift of pitch, the pocket burst, sending a plume of dust and heat upward. The drones scattered blindly, their formation broken. She slipped between them like a shadow. In that moment, she remembered the predators of her youth, how they would turn on each other when blinded by sudden light, and she used the same rule here. The drones crashed together, their sharp limbs tearing into one another in panic. By the time the dust cleared, she was already gone, standing on another ridge with the scarf bright against the dark. The audience of ships fell into uneasy silence. A single human had not only survived the first wave, but had used the land itself as a weapon. It was not supposed to happen. It broke the script of inevitability. Aisha knew this was only the beginning. The coalition had millions more to send, and their pride would not allow them to retreat. But she also knew something deeper, something that came from the heart of every human who had ever been cornered. When a predator discovered that its prey could fight back, doubt entered its bones. Doubt was the seed of fear, and fear was the mother of hesitation. On a battlefield, hesitation could kill armies. She stood tall on the ridge, lifted her head to the twin suns, and whispered to herself that survival was not a miracle. It was a skill, and it was the one skill humanity had mastered better than anyone. The silence that followed the destruction of the first drones did not last long. The coalition had not gathered 1 million soldiers to be made fools of by tricks of heat and dust. From the command banners came new orders, and the ground trembled as heavier units began to move. Aisha Khan watched from the ridge where she stood with the scarf tight around her arm. She knew the pattern already. The coalition would escalate slowly, sending wave after wave, each more dangerous than the last, until they broke her body or her spirit. That was the rhythm of arrogance, and arrogance was a rhythm she knew how to disrupt. She crouched low and listened to the hum of the pylons and the shifting air. The next storm was on its way. From the far side of the field came shapes that towered above the ridges. These were not simple drones, but armored war beasts controlled by distant pilots. They had 4 legs like mountains that had learned to walk, and their armor was painted in patterns meant to frighten. Some carried heavy cannons strapped to their backs, while others had long whips of plasma that cracked through the air like lightning. Aisha studied their movements carefully. Their steps were slow, but each step shook the ground like a drum. She realized that if she could learn their rhythm, she could turn it against them. The ground beneath her still held hidden pockets of pressure, and if she could make those beasts walk across the right lines, then their own weight would betray them. She began to walk toward them, not in haste but with steady steps. The coalition must have thought her insane to approach machines 10 times her height, but insanity was often what fear called courage. The beasts advanced in formation, their massive limbs crushing stone to powder. Aisha shifted her path until she stood directly on one of her marked fault lines. She waited, still as a shadow, until the nearest beast turned its head toward her. Then she raised her arm high and waved the scarf. The bright color drew their attention like fire in darkness. The pilots saw only arrogance and charged, eager to crush the human beneath their feet. The first beast reached her line, and the basalt groaned beneath its weight. Aisha dropped flat to the ground, pressed her body against the cold stone, and struck the surface with the flat of her palm. The sound traveled deep and met the pressure that already trembled inside. The ground split open with a roar, and the beast's front legs crashed through. It bellowed through its metallic throat as it sank into the hole. The pilot tried to pull it back, but the rear leg slipped and the entire machine collapsed sideways. The fall shook the ridge and threw up a cloud of broken rock. The second beast stumbled as the ground shifted beneath it. Aisha rose quickly and ran along the edge of the collapse, her suit amplifying each leap. She knew she could not defeat them all by force, but confusion was her ally. She shouted in her own language, the words meaningless to the aliens, but full of power when carried by her breath. The rhythm of her voice struck against the steady pounding of the beast's feet and broke their formation. One turned too fast and slammed into another. Their weapons fired wildly, searing the air with plasma that struck nothing but empty stone. The galaxy watched as one small figure turned a charge of armored giants into chaos, cameras fixed on her every step. Across distant ships, audiences leaned forward in disbelief. Some whispered that the coalition had made a mistake, that humanity was not prey but storm. The commanders tried to restore order, but hesitation had already rooted itself among the ranks. The beasts slowed, their steps no longer confident. Aisha stood tall on the ridge with the scarf blazing against the dark and let them see her calm. She wanted them to know that she had not been pushed to her limits, not yet. But the coalition was not finished. They pulled back the damaged beasts and sent forward a new kind of weapon. From the shadows came a swarm of smaller soldiers. Not drones and not machines, but living aliens bred for war. Their skin was black and ridged with armor. Their eyes glowed like embers, and they carried blades that dripped with acid. They did not march in formation, but ran in twisting lines, fast and low. Hunters rather than soldiers. Aisha felt a shiver at their speed, but she steadied her breath and prepared. She remembered the predators of her youth on the death world. They had moved like this in silence and in swarms, striking not from the front but from every side at once. The only way to survive had been to find the one sound that betrayed them, the faint break in the chorus of the night when the pack inhaled before the strike. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened. Around her the swarm hissed and growled, but beneath the noise she caught the rhythm of their movement. It was not the same as her own steady breath, but it had a pulse sharp and hungry. She began to walk in a counter rhythm, placing her steps where theirs would falter. When the first of them leapt, she turned aside just enough for its blade to strike stone. She caught its arm with her suit's reinforced grip and pulled it into the path of another. Their own weapons cut each other and both fell hissing. She did not stop to fight each one but moved with the patience of a river, always flowing, always bending. She lured them toward the dust bowls she had marked earlier. With a sudden stamp, she raised a veil of fine ash into the air. The hunters' glowing eyes were blinded, and in their confusion they turned on one another. The sound of their screeches filled the plain. The coalition commanders had expected a swift slaughter. Instead, they watched as their hunters tore at each other, while the human moved untouched through the chaos. Aisha did not smile, for she knew the day was still young and the waves would not stop. But inside her chest she carried the calm fire of certainty. Every hour she stole was victory. Every breath she drew was defiance. She raised her hand high once more so that all the watching eyes could see the scarf that still clung to her arm. It was not just a strip of cloth now, but a banner of survival. The one human still stood, and the million had yet to break her. The battlefield did not fall quiet after the swarm of hunters turned on one another, but instead shifted into a new and darker shape. The coalition had expected their hunters to finish what the drones and the beasts had failed to do, yet the human still walked across the plain with the scarf bright upon her arm. The commanders argued among themselves in their high bannerships, but pride forced them into a new decision. If strength and speed could not break the lone human, then perhaps fear could do what weapons could not. The order was given to send in the mind war specialists. From the edge of the broken moon came a procession of figures unlike any Aisha had faced before. They were tall and thin, with heads that pulsed with strange light, and their bodies were wrapped in veils of shifting color. They carried no weapons of metal, but instead projected waves of sound and scent that rolled across the plain like invisible tides. The air itself grew heavy with the flavor of despair, and the pylons vibrated with an unnatural hum that pressed against Aisha's skull. The galaxy audience leaned forward, for they knew that many warriors stronger than her had fallen to these mind singers, without a single wound on their flesh. Aisha felt the first wave strike her chest like a hand pressing down on her heart. Her knees trembled, and a cold whisper filled her ears, telling her that the battle was useless, that she was already dead, that the refugees she sought to save were lost. Her vision blurred and shapes twisted around her. She could almost see her own body lying broken on the ground. For a moment she swayed, but then she pressed her fingers against the scarf tied on her arm, and remembered the child who had given it to her. That scarf was more than cloth, it was a promise, and promises had weight stronger than lies. She forced her breath back into rhythm, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, the cadence steady and human. She adjusted her suit's transmitter and sent that rhythm outward on the hidden channel, a pulse of calm that pushed back against the alien waves. The mind singers advanced, their heads glowing brighter, their voices rising in a chorus that spoke of hopelessness and surrender. Yet through the veil of despair came another sound, faint but clear, the recorded voices of the refugees on her ship. She had carried those voices with her, simple words of thanks, of love, of memory, and now she played them into the battlefield. The alien chorus met the voices of children laughing, of elders singing old human songs, of families whispering prayers. The two sounds collided in the air and the field trembled. The coalition soldiers who listened began to hesitate, for the human voices were not filled with fear, but with life, and life had a rhythm that was stronger than despair. Aisha walked forward step by step, her body still shaking but her eyes clear. Every step was a refusal, every breath a weapon. The mind singers shifted tactics, filling the air with toxins that carried chemical fear, but Aisha's suit filtered them, and her mind clung to the rhythm. She remembered nights on her death world when the jungle sang with predators, and the only way to survive had been to close her eyes and listen to her own breath. She did the same now, shutting out the lies, hearing only the steady beat that made her human. She began to speak aloud, naming the refugees by the fragments of identity she carried: a craftsman, a teacher, a child with a scarf, a woman who had once planted flowers in soil long destroyed. Each name was a stone against the tide of despair. The galaxy watched in awe as the mind singers faltered. Their voices broke and their lights dimmed. Some clutched their veils and staggered back as if they too felt the weight of the names she spoke. It was not just resistance, it was counterattack. A single human voice turned against the most feared weapons of the coalition. Aisha kept walking, her figure small against the towering pylons, yet she seemed to fill the plain with her presence. She passed through the ranks of the singers and left them behind like broken reeds in a storm. The coalition commanders had believed the mind war would end the duel quickly, yet it had not. Instead, their own soldiers were shaken, their morale bruised by the sight of one woman breaking the unbreakable. Doubt spread like cracks in glass. The audience across the fleets began to whisper that perhaps numbers were not everything, that perhaps there was something in humanity that the scales of war could not measure. Aisha felt the ache in her body grow, but she ignored it. She had endured storms before, and storms always passed. She raised her head to the twin suns that hung low over the horizon and let their light wash over her. She had survived the drones, the beasts, the hunters, and now the mind singers. The coalition still had millions to send, yet with each wave she grew stronger in the eyes of those who watched. She did not need to destroy them all, only to endure, and endurance was her oldest ally. She stood upon a ridge and faced the banner ships with calm defiance. The chorus of fear had broken against her like waves against stone. She lifted her arm high so that the scarf rippled in the windless air, and the galaxy saw it not as cloth but as a banner of human spirit. For the first time, the coalition commanders wondered if they had made a mistake that could not be undone. The duel was far from over, but already the tide of belief had begun to shift. One human still stood, and in her standing the million had begun to tremble. The coalition grew restless as the human walked away from the shattered line of mind singers. Their voices had broken and their lights had dimmed, and still she endured. Pride had been wounded and anger swelled among the commanders. They had not expected to spend so much strength on one small figure, yet the eyes of the galaxy were upon them, and to retreat would be to admit that their power was not absolute. So they prepared their next trial. It was no longer about drones or hunters or singers, but about honor. They summoned their champions. The champions were warriors chosen from 100 species across the coalition. Each carried a relic weapon forged in battles older than humanity's first cities. Some bore spears of crystal that burned with caged stars. Others wielded blades that had drunk the blood of empires. Their armor was heavy with symbols of victory, and their bodies were scarred with 1,000 duels. When they stepped onto the field, even the watching fleets grew quiet. For in the galaxy there were few who could stand against a single champion, and here a human would face many. Aisha Khan watched them approach with steady eyes. She had known this moment would come. Strength against strength, champions against the lone outcast. Yet she also knew that strength was not always measured in muscle or in weapon, but in patience and in place. She had walked this battlefield and studied its bones. She had marked the cracks and the ridges where old fire still whispered beneath the stone. The champions carried relics, but she carried the map of the earth. Itself and the earth could be deadlier than any weapon when awakened. The champions raised their weapons high, and their voices thundered in a dozen tongues. They charged across the plain with a roar that shook the pylons. Aisha did not wait for them. She turned and ran toward the ridges she had chosen earlier. Her suit carried her swiftly across the basalt, each step precise and measured. The champions believed she fled in fear, and their laughter carried across the field. But she was not fleeing. She was leading. She reached a stretch of ground that she knew was hollow. Beneath lay a pocket of trapped gas and pressure, held in place by a fragile ceiling of stone. She leapt across it lightly, but the heavy armor of the champions would not. She slowed her pace just enough for them to close the gap, just enough for their weight to fall exactly where she wanted. The ground groaned, and the first champion stumbled as the stone cracked beneath him. Another landed beside him, and the ceiling shattered. Fire and smoke erupted upward with a roar as the pocket burst. The explosion tore through their ranks, hurling bodies and weapons into the air. Aisha spun aside and let the blast pass her. When the smoke cleared, several champions lay broken on the ground, and their relic weapons flickered with dying light. Those who rose staggered with disbelief. To be undone not by duel but by earth itself was a wound to their pride deeper than any cut. Aisha faced them calmly and raised her hand. She did not strike the fallen. Instead, she gestured for them to leave the field. Some stared at her in confusion, others in shame, and a few obeyed, dropping their weapons and stepping aside. The galaxy gasped to see mercy where none had been expected. The remaining champions roared in fury and came at her with all the strength they had left. Aisha met them with the rhythm of survival. She dodged the crystal spears, letting them bury themselves in stone where they shattered under their own power. She slipped beneath the arc of burning blades and guided them into one another until their sparks consumed each other's armor. She fought not with speed alone, but with the patience of someone who knew that every second she lasted was victory. The battle raged across the ridge, and each clash was broadcast to the watching fleets. Some soldiers began to murmur in their ranks. They saw champions fall one by one, not slain by the human's hand, but broken by their own mistakes and by the land that betrayed them. Doubt grew heavier in their hearts. If champions could not defeat her, then who could? When the dust settled, Aisha stood alone on the ridge, her suit scarred and her breath heavy, but her eyes still bright. Around her lay the relics of fallen champions and the broken stone of the battlefield. She raised the scarf tied to her arm, and the light of the suns caught it so it blazed like fire. The image spread across the galaxy and became a symbol that no commander could erase. In the coalition banner ships, the leaders shouted and raged. They had sent their drones, their beasts, their hunters, their singers, and now their champions. Each had failed. Yet the duel was not ended. The law still bound them to continue until the day was done or the human fell. Pride warred with fear in their voices. Some demanded overwhelming force, others warned that to break the law would shatter their reputation forever. Aisha stood on the ridge and listened to the echo of their arguments through the open channels. She did not need to know their language to hear the fear beneath the anger. She knew she had already won something greater than survival. She had planted the seed of hesitation in the heart of 1,000,000 soldiers. And hesitation could be deadlier than any weapon. She rested her hand on the scarf once more and whispered to herself that promises must be kept. She had promised to endure, she had promised to return the scarf, and she would keep those promises until the final breath of the final hour. The champions had fallen and the galaxy had seen it. Now the coalition must decide how much more pride they were willing to sacrifice before the day was through. The battlefield lay scarred after the fall of the champions. Shattered weapons burned in the dust, and the air smelled of smoke and stone. Aisha Khan stood upon the ridge, her shoulders squared, her breathing slow though her body ached with fatigue. The scarf tied around her arm fluttered faintly, though there was no wind. It had become more than a strip of cloth. To the watching millions, it had become a banner of resistance. Yet Aisha knew the day was not done. The coalition would not allow the duel to end with honor slipping from their grasp. They would strike again, but now hesitation weighed upon them. The banner ships pulsed with voices of discord. Some commanders demanded the release of overwhelming firepower. Others reminded them that to break the old law would bring shame across the galaxy. They argued in languages strange and harsh, but the message beneath them was the same. They could not agree. For the first time, cracks spread among them, cracks that had been carved by the endurance of one human. The fleets whispered to each other, and soldiers who had once mocked the duel now spoke with unease. Aisha stood silent through the storm of voices until she activated her channel. She spoke not in threat, but in calm words that carried across the open air. She asked for a ceasefire so that the wounded could be carried away. She asked that time be granted to those who had fallen, for they too had families waiting in distant homes. Her voice was firm yet not cruel. She did not demand surrender, only dignity. The coalition commanders fell silent, startled by the audacity of a human who dared to speak of mercy in the midst of war. For long moments no answer came, but then the murmurs spread among the lower ranks. Soldiers who had seen champions fall and mind singers break, began to lower their weapons. From the edge of the field, some moved forward not to strike but to gather their wounded. They carried them carefully, ignoring the shouts of their higher command. The old law did not forbid mercy, and the human had claimed it as her right. A ripple of defiance spread through the million. For the first time, obedience cracked, and cracks in an army can grow into storms. Aisha watched in silence as stretcher crews lifted their injured. She stepped aside, giving them clear passage, her hand resting on the scarf. Some of the soldiers dared to look at her directly. Their eyes were filled not with hatred but with confusion, even respect. She met their gaze and inclined her head once. That small gesture traveled faster than any weapon. The galaxy saw it, a human and alien exchanging recognition on the field of death. The commanders raged in their banners, furious that their soldiers dared to hesitate. They shouted orders, threatened punishment, but hesitation is stronger than fear when pride has already been wounded. More soldiers lowered their weapons, unwilling to strike at one who had shown them honor. It was not a surrender, not yet, but it was a fracture. Aisha knew it would not last forever. The coalition leaders would find a way to reassert control, yet every breath of ceasefire bought more time. Time was her true ally. She marked the suns as they drifted across the sky and counted the hours that had passed. Each hour brought her closer to victory. Her body ached and her mind carried the weight of fatigue, but she did not let it show. She stood tall on the ridge, her eyes steady, her stance unbroken. She had lived her whole life learning how to endure storms. Endurance was a language she spoke better than any other. She whispered again the names of the refugees who waited beyond the blockade. She saw their faces in her memory, and their voices rose in her heart. They gave her strength that no machine or relic could grant. The ceasefire could not hold forever. The commanders, desperate to regain control, summoned their overseers, towering war constructs bound by blood and command to their will. Even from afar, Aisha could see their massive shapes stirring in the distance, iron titans that had crushed revolts and ended wars. Their awakening shook the field, and the soldiers who had shown mercy fell back in silence. The ceasefire ended with dread rising in every heart, yet something had changed. The million no longer looked at her as a victim awaiting death. They looked at her as a figure who had endured what none should have endured. The whisper of fear that had once been meant for her now curled back toward the coalition itself. Fear of what it meant if even their greatest machines failed. Aisha knew the next test would be the hardest. The overseers were engines of destruction, yet she also knew the law. She did not need to defeat them, only to endure, and endurance had carried her this far. She took one more long breath, steady and calm. She looked at the soldiers who stood uncertain on the field's edge and then raised her hand high, so that the scarf caught the light. The audience across the galaxy held its breath. The final hours of the duel approached, and all knew that the outcome would shape not just the fate of refugees, but the story of humanity itself. The sky above the broken moon darkened as the overseer stepped forward. It was a towering construct of iron and bone, bound to the will of its commander, brewed through chains of blood and machine. Its body was a mountain of weapons, shoulders crowned with missile spires, arms ending in claws that could tear warships apart, and its chest glowed with the pulsing core of a captive star. The coalition had brought many weapons against Aisha Khan, but this was their last and most terrible, the weapon that had ended rebellions, crushed fleets, and silenced whole worlds. To unleash it against one human was madness, but pride had stripped the commanders of reason. They had sworn she would fall and they would see her broken no matter the cost. Aisha stood on the ridge with the scarf bound to her arm. Her body was bruised and her muscles screamed with every breath, but her eyes were clear. She had survived the drones, the beasts, the hunters, the singers, and the champions. She had turned the battlefield into her ally and bent the law of endurance into a weapon sharper than any blade. Now the overseer approached, each step shaking the ground as if the moon itself trembled. She knew she could not fight it with strength. She knew that even to endure would demand everything she had left. The overseer raised its claws and the air cracked with the sound of thunder. Soldiers across the coalition fleets watched in silence. Some clenched their fists in anger, others in fear. Even among the million, many wondered if this was victory or shame. For what honor was there in pitting such a monster against one human? Yet the law did not forbid it, and so the duel continued. Aisha began to climb down from the ridge. She moved not with haste, but with deliberate steps, each foot placed as if she were walking on the memory of her death world. The overseer turned its blazing eyes upon her and fired. Beams of light tore through the basalt where she had stood moments before, carving trenches of molten stone. The heat washed over her, searing through her suit, but she pressed on. She ran across ridges and through dust bowls, forcing the overseer to follow. The ground shook, cracks widened, and clouds of ash rose with each blast. To the watching millions, she seemed like a flame darting before a storm. Fragile, yet unbroken, she led the overseer toward the ruins she had studied earlier, where broken towers of basalt leaned against one another like crooked spears. The ground there was unstable, weakened by old pressure pockets. If she could lure the construct into that maze, perhaps the land itself could slow it. She reached the first tower and ducked behind it as the overseer fired again. The blast shattered the tower into shards that rained down like black rain. Aisha rolled aside, her breath ragged, and pressed on deeper into the ruins. The overseer followed, smashing through rock with claws that could split mountains. Each step brought it closer to the heart of the ruins. Aisha waited until she reached the ridge she had marked in her mind days earlier, when she first studied the battlefield. She planted her boots on the seam and turned to face the construct. She raised her arm high so the scarf shone in the dim light. Across the galaxy, billions held their breath. She spoke through the open channel so all could hear. She said that a human did not need to win by killing. A human needed only to endure. And endurance was the sharpest weapon of all. The overseer struck, driving its claws into the seam. The ground screamed as the old pocket burst. Fire and ash erupted upward, throwing the construct off balance. Its massive body staggered, one knee sinking into the fractured stone. The ruins groaned under its weight, and one by one the leaning towers began to collapse. Shards of basalt rained down upon the overseer, burying its arms and shoulders. It roared, tearing free, but every movement trapped it deeper. Aisha watched from the ridge as the monster thrashed against the earth itself. She had not slain it, but she had endured it. The soldiers of the coalition saw what had happened, and many lowered their weapons. They saw a single human force their mightiest construct into the dust, not with strength, but with patience and with the will to stand. Murmurs spread through the fleets, voices rising in defiance against their commanders. Some shouted that the duel was already decided, that the day had been won. Others whispered that humanity could not be measured on scales of numbers, that one human heart was heavier than 1,000,000 blades. The overseer still struggled, its weapons firing wildly into the sky, but the suns had drifted low. The bright line that marked the duel's day began to fade. The hour of endurance had passed. The law was clear. Humanity had endured. The duel was over. Aisha fell to her knees, her strength at last spent, but she kept one hand upon the scarf. She had promised to return it, and promises must be kept. She lifted her head as the final chime rang across the field. The galaxy roared in shock and awe. One human had faced 1,000,000 and still stood at the end of the day. The coalition could not deny it. Their pride was broken and their power shamed. The refugee corridor opened. The ships passed through, their engines burning bright, carrying families to safety. Aisha was carried back to her sloop, her body weary, but her spirit unbroken. The scarf was still tied to her arm. She placed it gently into the hands of the child who had given it to her, and whispered that promises had been kept. The child wept and held it close. Across the galaxy the story spread. Some told it as legend, others as warning. They said that one human had faced 1,000,000 and endured. They said that humanity was not a species to be measured by numbers, but by the will to survive against all odds. And wherever the story was told, the galaxy remembered the scarf blazing like fire against the dark. When the final chime faded across the battlefield, the silence that followed was heavier than any storm the galaxy had ever known. The overseer lay buried beneath collapsed towers of basalt, its claws still twitching in vain against the grip of the broken moon. The banners of the coalition flickered with confusion and shame. They had unleashed 1,000,000 soldiers and machines against one woman, yet she still stood. Aisha Khan rose slowly from her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion, yet her back unbent. The scarf still clung to her arm, scorched and stained, yet shining like a flame in the dim light of the twin suns. The law was clear, and none could twist it now. A full day had passed. She had endured. The duel was over. In the corridors of power, aboard the banner ships, the commanders raged and shouted, but their words fell hollow. The soldiers who had watched every moment no longer looked at her as prey, but as something that broke the weight of numbers with nothing but will. Many lowered their weapons and turned their eyes away, for they could not bear to witness the shame of what had been done. Some whispered quietly that perhaps humanity was not to be measured as other species were measured. Perhaps humanity was something new, something dangerous, something that could never be erased by force alone. The refugee ships stirred as the blockade broke apart. Engines lit like a constellation across the dark, and one by one, the ships carried their people through the corridor. The families who had been waiting in terror now saw the lane open and wept in relief. They owed their survival to the one human who had stood where none should have stood. Aisha returned to her sloop carried by her crew, though she wished to walk on her own feet. The scarf was untied from her arm and returned to the small hands that had given it. The child pressed it to her face and cried. Aisha touched her hair and whispered that promises had been kept. News of the duel swept across the galaxy. Some spoke it in whispers, afraid to anger their rulers. Others shouted it as defiance in the marketplaces of 100 worlds. They told of one human who endured against 1,000,000. They told of relic, weapons shattered by stone of hunters, blinded by dust of singers, silenced by the voices of children. They told of champions humbled and of a construct buried beneath the ruins it had trusted to destroy. They told of a woman who carried a scarf into battle and made it a banner that no empire could take from her. In time, the story became more than a tale of war. It became a warning to those who thought humanity weak and a light to those who had none left to follow. For it was said that if even one human stood, the galaxy itself could tremble. Aisha Khan returned to her people scarred but unbroken. She carried no crown, no titles, no treasures, only the quiet strength of one who had endured and the knowledge that survival is the sharpest weapon of all. And so the duel ended not with the roar of victory, but with the quiet truth that endurance had carried one woman through the storm of 1,000,000. Humanity was no longer a rumor whispered in fear. Humanity was a fact carved into the stone of a broken moon and into the memory of every eye that had seen her stand. The end.